Thankfully, I had it correct in my diary. Yeah. Anyway, so what we're going to be looking at today is one of the #1 questions I think I've heard over the last 10 years. People always want to know, when is the best time to publish? And so our marketing director, Kelly, she said to me, Alex, please can you host a webinar introducing KAWO's new time predict feature? It's actually something we worked on many years ago, and we tried to build some machine learning to tell you the best time to publish your post. And we recently went back and our CTO looked at that feature again, and we really improved the way we do it, both technically and visually. My big worry is that after today's webinar, I'm going to be fired by Kelly because sadly, the conclusion is probably not what she was hoping for when she told me to host a webinar. Anyway, let's see what we find out when we look at the data. So this is the new feature that we have launched. When you are scheduling your post, you can click on the scheduled date box, and you will get this new UI that looks like this, and it lets you drag the slider, and it shows you this graph going from cool blue all the way to sort of pink red, which is the best time to post. And depending on how long your account has been connected, you will either get a prediction based on all of KAWO's WeChat data, or you will get a prediction just for your account if you create enough content. KAWO sadly doesn't quite create enough content on our own account to get a customized prediction, so we get the same prediction for everybody. You can see that I took this screenshot at 16:44, just a few minutes ago, and you can see that doesn't allow me to schedule in the past. And when I select another day, you'll see that you get a different prediction. So you can, it's much more customized and refined. Our CTO, Brian, put a lot of work into refining the way we build this prediction. And it doesn't just do it for WeChat, it also does it for Weibo and also Douyin. So once you've selected your video, you can click schedule and you'll get a similar interface of Douyin. And again, you get to choose between all Douyin accounts or just for this Douyin account. So now I've told you all about the new feature. Let's have a look at whether or not this is really a big factor in the success of your content. I was genuinely curious when I started doing this research because I didn't know the answer. I knew a lot of people cared about it, so I thought, well, let's use KAWO's huge amount of data we have from many, many years and see if we can try and find a good answer to this. So let's get into the data. I'm afraid if you're not a big nerd like me, this might be a bit too mathematical, but hopefully you will enjoy it. So there's a couple of principles that I want to be very clear about. This analysis has been objective. I do not know what any of the content was that was performing well or not well. And it's also anonymous. I didn't know who the accounts were. I just had anonymized data. So I was looking at it really just based on the numbers. So the methodology, I exported all the data, or our CTO, Brian, exported all the data from KAWO's database. We anonymized it to make it more objective. I used SQL, which looks a bit like this, for any of you who are familiar with databases, to extract the data into a format that I could use, and then made huge Google Sheets that look a little bit like this. And then inside the Google Sheets, I was able to transform the data in ways I needed to try and analyze lots of different accounts together. There is a big challenge when you're looking at data across multiple accounts, because as you can imagine, different accounts perform differently. So one of the first challenges I had to overcome was looking at what this data was composed of. I almost always do this whenever I get a new data set, is just see how many articles do we have? How many of them are first position? How many of them are segmented? How many of them are sent to over 50,000 followers or less than 1,000 followers? And also, I had a look at what percentage of articles got their reads from other, because we're always a bit suspicious when we see that. So in a second, you'll see why. And then once I had done all that data analysis, which took a long time, I created these slides in a crazy rush. So apologies if the formatting's not as beautiful as you might be expecting. So this we also did for Douyin as well. And one of our big challenges is making everything comparable, because you can imagine maybe a B2B account will perform differently to a B2C account. Martin, I think you might have your microphone on. I can hear some sound. Do you have your microphone? Okay. Somebody has their microphone on. One of the big things I have to do is to try and make everything comparable, because you can imagine if we have account A, account B, account C, D, and E, they all have a different number of posts. So maybe one of these accounts puts a lot of effort into their content. Maybe like account E, they post a lot, so they get relatively less engagement. So one of the ways we do this is we switch from using open rate with articles or engagement rate with Douyin videos, and we turn everything into percentile distribution. So this allows us to compare the top 1% of the posts on one account with the top 1% of posts on another account, or 10%, 5%, bottom 10%. So this is how I flatten out all the data, so it's now comparable. The other thing, okay, so if any of you at this point are thinking, oh my God, I should have listened in maths class, yeah, I'm sorry if this is a little bit nerdy, but stick with me. So the next thing I want to just point out is that correlation doesn't always mean causation. I actually love this website here. You can see the example here. It says people who have drowned falling into a pool with films Nicolas Cage appeared in. Even though these two lines match up very closely, there's obviously no link. Another example for you here, the letters of the winning word in the spelling bee, the number of people killed by spiders. Now, what we try to do is to more than just look at the graph like this, but we try to actually use a proven methodology to test whether or not that is a real correlation. So for this case, we're using Pearson's correlation coefficient, and this is where some of you might remember from high school maths. So you can have a strong positive correlation that goes up like that. You can have a strong negative correlation that will be -1, so we can go from +1 to -1. And if it's in the middle, it means that the data is just randomly distributed. So what we're hoping to see is this number to be as close to 1 or -1 as possible. And you can run this on huge data sets, and it will just give you this simple number. Okay, let's move on from the maths. So let's start by just looking at the overall picture of how content performs. This is just a slice of content taken from across our platform. One of the things that is really important to understand is the top 20% of content is really getting you at least half of your shares and about 35% of your reads. This has changed a little bit over the years. But what we're really looking at is we're looking at that best performing content. That's what we're trying to find here. If we actually break it down into smaller amounts and we go into the top 10% and we break it down by 2%, you'll see the top 2% of content published through KAWO in the last 5 years got 20% of the shares and 9% of the reads. So what we're trying to find out is what are the factors that put it in that top percentage? Is it the time that it's published, or is there something else to it? So let's start with WeChat. Okay, some of my slides might be a bit slow because there's a lot of data on them. So we're going to start with WeChat, and what we looked at here was 31,000 articles from 350 accounts, and published between January 2018 and February 2023. So we've got a good period of time, a lot of accounts. They say that if your data set has anything less than about 1,000 items, you can't really take a conclusion. So we're well over that. We've got 30,000 and we've got 350 very different accounts. We have accounts across 13 different industries connected to our platform. And so we should see some patterns across this. So now I will just move on to the next slide. Okay, so one of the first things we had to do is to clean the data. So we only care about the top position articles because that one gets the most real estate in your phone. So we're not going to look at position 2, position 3, position 4. The next thing we are also looking at is non-segmented articles. This example here was sent on our own account. I think our developers were testing, and you can see it was only sent to 2 followers and it got 12 reads. So it achieved a huge 600% reach rate because it got such a high number of reads. So we have to get rid of anything that was sent to maybe, I think we took less than 90% of the followers. So we have to clear out those articles too. And the final thing is no funny business. This is a real screenshot from a real account. And as you can see, something very weird has happened. 47,000 of the reads are from other, and they all happened on the 4th and 5th day after it was published. I'm not going to reveal which account this is, but I can tell you that this looks shady to me. Whoever is managing this account was doing something. I'm hearing feedback. Hopefully somebody's not got their microphone on. So we had to clean out anything that looks a bit strange. So that's why in the spreadsheet you also saw I was looking at the percentage of where those reads came from as well, to make sure we're only looking at legitimate data. Okay, so let's start. Let's have a look at the open rate of WeChat articles over the years. We're taking the median. The reason why we're taking the median is because it's less affected by extremes, and you can often get some extremes in social media. You'll have one article that performed insanely well, and that will drag the entire average up. But by taking the middle number, we're getting a more representative sample. It's not a pretty picture. You can see that in the last 5 years, the open rate has dropped from over 6% to now being down at about 2% at the end of last year. So it is getting harder and harder to get people to open your WeChat articles. And I think we've also seen this in changes that WeChat have made. WeChat initially, was it last year or the year before, muted notifications on service accounts by default, and recently turned notifications off completely on service accounts. On subscription accounts, they have also changed the way that that content appears. You'll see that articles that are less popular, they won't get the full cover image. They've also switched to showing an algorithmic subscriptions folder. WeChat's constantly making small changes to try and make sure that users are getting to see the best content. Some of you may be hearing what I'm saying and already know what the conclusion is, but let's keep going. So the first thing I did was look at whether or not the time of day and day of the week had a significant impact. And so you can see here, we've got all of the hours from Monday at midnight to Sunday at midnight. And you can see quite clearly a pattern in when articles are published. And that number in the middle is the Pearson's correlation. So you can see it is very close to 0. Generally, anything under 0.5 is considered to be no correlation. This is 0.013. So this data is effectively random. There is no link between the time of day and day of the week. But I wasn't done with this. I thought, well, perhaps this isn't the best way to run this correlation, especially because Pearson's is looking for a linear correlation, and maybe the way I formatted this data would not work. So next I looked for whether or not the performance of a post was linked to the amount at which it was shared. And look at this correlation here. So we've got WeChat shares versus unique reads, and you'll actually see some lines going across this diagram. We've got a correlation of 0.65. So this is kind of a weak correlation. It's not a very strong correlation. But it does mean that the more shares you get, the more likely you are going to get a top performing article. So when you're looking at the breakdown of how your content is being read, you really want to be looking at how that content is getting shared and if it's getting shared. I've said this many times before, when you're analyzing your WeChat content, sort that column in your spreadsheet by the percentage of the reads that came from sharing, and then pay attention to those articles. Those are very likely the ones that are providing more value to your audience. So you can see kind of a weak correlation. You can sort of roughly see it, but yeah. So the next thing I looked at was, okay, maybe there isn't a link between the hour of the day, but maybe it's related to how quiet the time is. My logic was this: a lot of articles are getting published right now, 5 to 8 p.m. on a Friday and a Thursday evening, are two of the peak times in the week to publish. Now, what you can see is there is a kind of trend here. It's a very rough trend. So over on the left, we have the busiest hours of the week for publishing. You can see there's a lot of big circles there. That's the number of articles is the size of the circle. And you can see much higher up over to the right, we have some smaller circles. So it does seem that there is a slight impact, but I will say this is a very weak correlation in this case between the hour of the week and the number of articles being published and the success of the post. This is not a strong linkage. You'll see even further along the graph, there are some circles still quite low when not a lot of content's being published. Okay, so we've taken a look at WeChat and kind of concluded that actually there's not really much impact to when you publish, but actually there is a big impact, well, a statistically significant impact from whether or not your content is shared. Let's take a look at probably the extreme other type of social network that we deal with, which is Douyin. WeChat, remember, you're publishing to a confined audience. It's more like an email newsletter. The number of followers you have is going to have a huge impact on how many reads your content is going to get. Those are the people that will have the content pushed to them. The only way other people will find out about that content is if one of those people who already follows you takes that content and shares it. Obviously, there are other ways like article history, but the majority of reads will either be from being a follower or that content being shared. Douyin is very different. The number of followers you have on Douyin really doesn't affect how popular your content is. You can have a new account and still do pretty well. So let's see what's significant about Douyin. Does time make a big impact on Douyin? So here again, oddly enough, we have a similar number of videos, but from a lot less accounts. 31,103 videos from 182 accounts, published between December 2019, which is when we very first got connected to Douyin, and February this year. So we've had connection to Douyin for about 3 years. And we were one of the first platforms who got access to the data. So we're lucky in that sense. Okay, let's have a look. Oh my goodness, I forgot to animate this properly. So we're going to be looking at Douyin's engagement. So we're going to be looking at comments, shares, forwards, and digs or likes. We're going to be comparing that to plays as well. Let's start by looking at the time of the week. So in this case, there is an even weaker correlation. So remember, we're looking for either +1 or -1 as there being a perfect correlation. Here it is 0.067. For Douyin, it does not matter when you publish. You can publish at midnight, 4 a.m., 6 p.m. on a Friday. Will have basically no impact at all on whether or not your content is successful. However, remember we just looked at engagement. If we go back to looking at engagement, we will see that the most plays and the most engagement, you can probably already see this very clearly across this diagram. There is a very strong correlation here. It is 0.83. That is a really strong correlation. So on Douyin, it's all driven by the algorithm. The more likes, comments, reshares you get, the more successful your content is going to be. Really doesn't matter how many followers you have, the time of day, it's all about that engagement. Now, I think this is one of the big challenges with Douyin, is it means that it can be hard to get your content to your followers in kind of a logical way. In WeChat, you could publish a series of posts. You could say, okay, this is part 1 of 4, and you could guarantee that anybody who's a follower would at least see that next part, the third part, the fourth part. They could see like a logical series. If you created a logical series of content on Douyin, it would be incredibly hard to ensure your followers got that in a logical way. It would all depend on the individual performance of each piece of content. So Douyin can be a really challenging platform, and especially for brands where it is hard to create content that is engaging, that gets people to click or like or comment. So I don't have a magic solution, but it does mean that the storytelling and the way you package your content is really important. This is something we've seen in ourselves over the years. You can actually take quite a boring message or a boring idea for content and make it kind of interesting if you package it in the right way, if you tell a story in an interesting way. Similarly, you can actually have really good ideas for content that don't do as well if you rush them or you don't craft that content really well. It really is a case where quality beats quantity on almost all platforms these days. And in fact, on some platforms like WeChat, you're actually penalized for quantity. So it's really quality that's most important. So the conclusion is the same thing that you've possibly heard me say this before. Don't waste time posting shitty content. You really need to be focusing on creating great content with love and care. As my good friend Elijah Whaley said, your content should be a gift to your audience, and you don't want to give somebody a shitty gift. So that is the content I have for you today. I hope you found it interesting. Sadly, although the team have built this new feature to tell you the best time to post, what we've actually found out is the time you post really isn't a strong factor in the success of your content, but we have made it a lot more user-friendly to schedule content, and that's one of our goals as well, was to take that small little schedule window and turn it into something more user-friendly. Thank you very much. And does anybody have any questions they would like to ask? I realize it's been quite a short webinar. It is Friday evening, so I didn't want to keep you too long with an hour of maths and graphs. But if anybody has any questions, I'll happily answer them now. Let me see, can I open the chat? I don't know if Martin has allowed you guys to speak. Maybe not. In the chat, do we have any questions? Okay, we've got somebody who is typing. I'm sorry, I'm not very good at using Teams. Anybody got any questions? Or is everybody just desperate to get out of the office on Friday? Okay, if we don't, okay, we've got Olivia has jumped in there as I was about to end the webinar. I know you spoke about quality over quantity. When it comes to Douyin, do you see brands trying to post as much as see what sticks? That's interesting. We do see some brands putting quite a lot of focus on Douyin, but I think that's more of a case of they just are more excited about that. I've been involved in this business for so long that I've seen multiple social networks come and some go. And there's always so much excitement over a newer platform. We've definitely seen teams moving budget away from Weibo, moving effort as well, away from Weibo to WeChat, and even now from WeChat to Douyin. And video is actually a theme across all platforms. The thing about Douyin is you're not penalized from posting more, but the thinner you spread your efforts, you are definitely going to be less successful. If you really take a video and lovingly have multiple iterations, get more feedback, show it to a few people and see what they think, increase the timing, maybe make sure there's no boring pauses in it, you're definitely going to see better results from just crafting your video better. Martin has a question here saying, from our WeChat channel live stream, what are the latest social trends that are happening in China? I must admit, I have no idea. If you saw one of my previous webinars, Kelly asked me to give a webinar about social trends and I refused, because I don't think what's trending really has a big impact on how successfully you connect with your customers. I think the most important thing is how much you understand your customers and how much value you're trying to create for them. As we saw, the time you post, not that important. How you connect with your customers and build trust with them through the content you create is really important. Even though this has only been like a less than half an hour webinar, I spent many, many hours doing the analysis and preparing the slides for this webinar. And so hopefully I'm not giving you a shitty gift on a Friday evening. Hopefully you see and appreciate the effort that I put into this. That really is the best advice that I can give you based on years of trying to do this. Really put love and care into your content and your audience will feel that. Question from the Singapore office, how to balance brand image on Douyin but suits Douyin's style? That's a good question. I think, yeah, it's tricky because there are different ways to interpret brand image. Brand image can be visually, and this is where you can maybe sometimes have some tension with head office. I know certainly in the luxury brand area, they often have these very strict brand guidelines, and Douyin is a platform that doesn't really love content that's too maybe too kind of stuck to the guidelines. So it can be tricky. There is also brand image in terms of the tone. So for example, KAWO's content always tries to be friendly and fun. We try never to have our content being too serious. And that's where I think you can make sure that your brand image on Douyin is the same. You don't have to completely change your style to be successful on Douyin. There are lots of helpful help tips on Douyin and how-to videos. It's increasingly a popular search engine and people go there to search for how to boil an egg, how to make this, how to do that. So I think you can definitely see Douyin as it matures. It's got a richer ecosystem of content. And so I believe it is possible to keep your brand feeling, but perhaps maybe not the exact guidelines that your brand has. Maybe that is helpful. Martin, do we have any more questions? No more questions. Well, thank you everybody for joining this webinar. It really, I'm very grateful for you listening to me on a Friday evening, and I hope you all have a great weekend. And don't forget, you can always email us, hello@kawo.com, if you have any questions. Thanks ever so much.